Yeah, so the sort of like notion of Iranians being Aryans and the racialization of Iranians as white is something that predates the Islamic Republic. The monarchy actually um, promoted that kind of an idea, right? There's quotes from the Shah saying things like, we're not like our Semitic neighbors, like the Arabs and the Turks and does he refer to, I think, Semitic Jews as well, if I'm not mistaken. But the idea was to say, well, we are, distinct. And some of the language that was used under the monarchy, there's a scholar, Zia Ebrahimi, I think, if I'm not getting it wrong, who talks about self-orientalizing, right? So we become self-orientalized because the idea is we now see ourselves as being so inferior that we have to try to emulate something else, especially the West. And that can be also a racial kind of emulation.
Jewish self-hatred. I think the article was called "On Jewish Self-Hate," and he's writing about the Jewish population in Europe and the U.S. at a time when anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish prejudice was just completely socially accepted, just out in the open. And he describes the reaction of a lot of Jewish people living in these societies that it's not like they're thinking consciously in this way, but fundamentally what's happening is there's a recognition that you're going to be hated and discriminated against by a lot of people with power in your society. Therefore, for your self-betterment, you should try to distance yourself away from that group that is so hated. But because we don't think in these kind of logical, rational terms, what ends up happening on a psychological level is forget about the recognition of I'm going to be hated by the dominant group. You end up developing a kind of dislike and hatred for your own group as a means of distinguishing yourself from that group, putting yourself outside of the realm of prejudice and hatred, and trying to assimilate to the dominant group. And so the whole paper is fascinating because it's exactly what Kareem you talk about when you talk about colonial mentality. It's just colonial mentality in the particular form it existed in the Jewish diaspora in the 1930s and 1940s.
So would you say, so we were talking about the fact that you have a lot of people in the Iranian community who are actually very much against the Islamic Republic and they are pro-Israel. We talked about that. And would you say that a lot of the Iranians in, say, the United States, because we have quite a few in the Netherlands as well, would you say that they are identify as like liberals, like liberal Iranians? How would you qualify that group?
Or I think like any other group, they're politically diverse, right? They're not
Mm-hmm.
only are they diverse in their how they racially identify, how they religiously identify, but also just politically. I mean, I think you have at least in the American diaspora, you have Iranians who are progressive, more like left-leaning. You definitely have those who would identify as like liberals, sort of like your establishment Democrat type party, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then you also have like conservatives, Republicans, very staunch Trump supporters, the reason I say Trump supporter and not Republican is because just like you have like progressives and then liberals within the Democratic Party, you also have, a split within the Republican Party. Like there are Republicans who absolutely hate Trump, and then of course there are people who identify as Republicans who like Trump. And I think Iranians in the diaspora really hit all of those different areas of that political spectrum. What happens though is only a portion or like one segment of that population really gets a platform. And so that becomes sort of representative of the entire population. But of course, that's not the case. So you have pro-Israel Iranians in the diaspora, you have pro-Palestinian Iranians in the diaspora, just like you would in any other group where people fall across these different areas of the spectrum.
And how would you qualify? And I meant specifically, how would you qualify those that are pro-Israel, for example? Where does that come from?
So I think there is, especially maybe in the last year or very, very recent years, as resentment and anger towards the Islamic Republic has increased. anything that can even be, that's even considered within that realm is just hated, and then anything that's against it is elevated. So, but that's if you take a somewhat extreme version of like looking at these events, right? If you have no nuance, if it's just like, well, they're against the Islamic Republic and we're against the Islamic Republic, so we're the same, right? Like if you think about it that way, then you can see why that alignment exists. Obviously, Israel is an outspoken critic of the Islamic Republic. But there are also, I mean, one thing that I think is actually common and ubiquitous amongst the Iranian diaspora in the US and everywhere else, and arguably a majority even within the country of Iran, is that they're against the Islamic Republic. Like that's not a unique position to hold. But how that gets then interpreted and understood within your other political views, that's, I think, where the difference lies. So you certainly have people on the left and the right who are against the Islamic Republic for various reasons, especially as you see Iranian suffering, you see greater repression. For obvious reasons, you would be against that. But then there's a sort of irony to then aligning with other repressive states, right? So if you're for human rights and international law, which is something that we should all be for, and we should apply it to, say, when there's protests that are being squashed in Iran, right? You have UN resolutions, you have condemnations, all these things are correct. It's just that those same people then don't apply that same law to, say, the state of Israel right now. And it's only because the state of Israel is against the Islamic Republic, and there's the idea that the Islamic Republic supports Hamas specifically. And even that is like presented in a way where, you know, Iran is sort of this puppet master and all of these proxies are controlled by Iran. That's not really the reality on the ground. Hamas and Iran have Iran did not create Hamas. They certainly have supported rhetorically and materially the actions of Hamas, but also they've had strains, right? In the Syrian conflict, Iran was on the side of Bashar al-Assad, Hamas was not, you know? So the idea that these groups are simply controlled by Iran is also very misleading. Like these are all groups that have their own interests, they have agency, and they have their own reasons why they make certain decisions. And they don't just listen to whatever, you know, Khamenei is saying in Tehran.
It's not exactly the same, but it's a little bit like saying every time a newspaper reports on Hamas, they would say the Israeli-backed Hamas. The Israeli-backed Hamas did this, because there is a historical record of Israeli government support for Hamas. But it's kind of like I just saw
Netanyahu-backed
the
Hamas.
other day. Yeah, I just saw
Netanyahu-backed Hamas.
Right. Likud-backed Hamas. Saw a paper the other day about the Houthis, and like 5 times in the article it said Iran-backed Houthis, the Iran-backed Houthis, you know, so.
Yeah,
well, that's the way the language is used, right? Because you've already established, if you're in the Western media, especially if you're in the United States, you've already established like Iran is bad, right? That's very simple to the psyche. Or I see Iran, that must be bad. And so if you just keep linking that word to it, then all of those things become under that umbrella. But the issue is you're losing a real understanding of the situation on the ground, you know, especially like with the Houthis. The Houthis have a great deal of independence from Iran. Like these are not, it's not to say, and you would never talk about it the other way, right? I mean, the United States, Israel exists in the way that it does today because of the United States. And this is not something I'm saying, this is something, you know, Israeli officials from Golda Meir from decades ago have been saying. Israel can exist in this fashion, at least, completely protected from any kind of accountability because of the United States. We provide it with billions of dollars in military aid, advanced weapons, rhetorical protection from international law. So this is but you would never say, you know, the US backed IDF, because that wouldn't make any sense. Like Israel makes decisions. It does not care what the US says because it is an independent state and it makes decisions based on its own interests. And there's different actors within that state that make decisions that are different from each other, even based on their own interests, right? So Israel can't be described as this monolith. Like Netanyahu is a specific case, as we were just saying, like he's a specific case of someone who thought, well, you know, allowing Hamas to sort of exist and split the Palestinian power, essentially, or the Palestinian movement, I should say, would be in the interest, in his view, of Israel. Not everyone in the Israeli security apparatus would agree, right? So it's just the problem with the way that we use language is that we're not actually trying to understand everything. We're just trying to reduce everything to good guy, bad guy, and let's just understand it that way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that and what you said before about the Iranian American diaspora reminds me of the halo effect, where if you see a person or a group as good in one thing that's important to you, you tend to extend that like a halo and think that everything that they do must be good, because you're thinking in such categorical terms that don't allow for good and bad to be in the same entity. So it's like my parents with the Republican Party. Oh, they're against abortion. Okay, so then I'm going to adopt everything that they believe.
That's why white supremacy is such a good ideological phenomenon, because it always creates that halo effect. You can get away with so much stuff because you don't link all these negative stereotypes to being white, and you can have terrorist attacks every week by white supremacists. The terrorist just stays the stereotyped Muslim, even though the amount of terrorist attacks are much lower. You know, even the FBI, I saw that even the FBI studied that, and that showed that white supremacist terrorism is a bigger problem in the United States than religious terrorism. But I wanted to come back before we go a bit deeper into language. I wanted to go back to what you just said, Assal, about this. You have these people in the Iranian diaspora who identify with everything that is pretty much against the Islamic Republic of Iran, you know? Mm-hmm. So these people are probably often very anti-religious, or I would say anti-Muslim.
That thread certainly exists.
Yeah, okay, the thread exists. Okay, so
I'd be very careful not to generalize, you know.
Yeah. Correct me if I generalize too much, because I have that tendency to then generalize the other way. But let's say, okay, they're against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and therefore they side often with those who are also against that. For example, the biggest examples are the United States and Israel. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, and I find that from a psychological viewpoint always very interesting, is how that intertwines with your ethnic or racial identity. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that if you are so against that Islamic Republic, you also must be aware that when you side with a group that is also against the Islamic Republic, you also must be aware of the stereotypes that exist towards people that are in the mind connected to the Islamic Republic of Iran, you know, and that is that there is, when you grow up in the West, you get this stereotype of what people look like when they come from Iran. So the only way to escape that, to be lumped together with these with people who are seen as representative of people from the Republic, Islamic Republic of Iran, is to de-identify actually also racially, you would say, with that kind of group. So that is that you would almost do your best to be more white than to look like a typical Iranian, because you know that in the West and other parts of the world, that is lumped together, that look, the way, that identity with somebody from the Islamic Republic of Iran. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that how do people deal with that struggle? That means you actually have to identify almost as white, I would say. You know what I mean? Do you understand what I get at?
Yes. Yeah, so the sort of like notion of Iranians being Aryans, and the racialization of Iranians as white is something that predates the Islamic Republic. The monarchy actually promoted that kind of an idea, right? There's quotes from the Shah saying things like, you know, we're not like our Semitic neighbors, like the Arabs and the Turks and does he refer to, I think, Semitic Jews as well, if I'm not mistaken. But the idea was to say, well, we are, you know, distinct. And some of the language that was used under the monarchy, there's a scholar, Zia Ebrahimi, I think, if I'm not getting it wrong, who talks about self-orientalizing, right? So we become self-orientalized because the idea is we now see ourselves as being so inferior that we have to try to emulate something else, especially the West. And that can be also a racial kind of emulation. So there's a debate within the Iranian community as well about, well, something as simple as the US Census, right? So the US Census will ask you what racial category you fit into. And if you anywhere where in the US, if you're trying to fill out something and it asks you your like ethnic background or your race or anything like that, there's no, I think in some cases you can see like Arab, or like Arab would be a category. Obviously that wouldn't be the category for, some Iranians are Arab, but there's a minority Arab population in the south, I want to say west of Iran. But predominantly Iranians are not Arabs. And so what category do we belong to? And there's this whole thing. So you usually have to mark white. And the objection to that for some of us, not for everyone, right? This is a debate within the community, is we are not perceived as white by people who are white. And the problem with this notion of race is the not understanding that while race can be affiliated with physical characteristics, it doesn't have to be, because it's just a construct, right? So it's not about what you actually look like. It's much more about, do you belong to the group that is dominant, or do you not belong to the group that is dominant? And it's usually the dominant group that decides who belongs, right? That's the whole point of being the dominant group. And so in my experience, for instance, as an Iranian American, as someone who was born in the US and raised in the US, I was asked many, and I still get asked all the time, where are you from? Now, if I say California, there'll be a follow-up question.
Where are you really?
For whatever reason, I was born there, but where I'm from is never really California. And the difference is not, obviously, the entirety of this hemisphere is immigrant populations, because we committed genocide. I mean, Europeans committed genocide against the native population, colonized 500 years ago the entire hemisphere. And now basically everybody here is an immigrant except for the little native population that still exists. But a white European, and I'm using white here again as the idea of what descent you come from, is never asked, where are you from? Like, Peter, how many times did people ask you where you're from? And when you said Virginia, you got no. But originally.
Where in Europe?
I believe
where
zero.
In Europe? No, but go back to Europe, man.
When I was a kid, a common
where are you really from?
What are you? Not where are you from? What are you? And then you're supposed to answer like what nation your ancestors came from.
Yeah, right. No, it's a very interesting.
What?
These are very interesting things that you say, Assal, and it reminds me of a field of study that I'm very interested in called colonial mentality, and it's the internalized hierarchies that come from colonial cultures, and that is and often you will see that people from stigmatized groups want to de-identify with that group and actually identify with the higher status groups, and that is usually white. And you also see that in the Middle East and among Arabs. I mean, many Arabs in the West just hide their background and just identify as white. And I know that in the United States Census, as an Arab, you are supposed to identify as white, but I also know that there is a large segment that would never be identified as white, because you can immediately see it, or you can hear it, also the name. And
actually, I think this is an important point to bring up, because this is where the physical characteristics come into play. And so while whiteness is sort of the dominant group, and that's the side you want to be on, we also have to like acknowledge the idea of being white passing, right? So because the other side of it is specifically anti-blackness, and that's something that people who might not be considered white by the dominant group itself, because they're not from European descent, are then themselves racist against Black people. Right. So you see racism within, say, the Arab community, the Iranian community. This exists within those communities as well, even while those communities might be seen as sort of or othered or seen as less than, orientalized by the dominant white community. At the same time, they still have prejudices and racism towards other communities because they're in this sort of, they think, well, we're white passing. So I always take an issue with that, because I think, especially for those in any of these communities, like right now, if you're Palestinian and you're talking about Palestinian liberation and you're talking about, international law and human rights and all these extremely important things, but then you turn around tomorrow and say, and I'm not saying this is what they're doing, I'm saying this as a hypothetical. I'm saying hypothetically, then if you turn around tomorrow and you're a Palestinian in the American diaspora and you're okay with injustice against Black people, then I think that's still a problem, right? Because the entire point of the language of justice, of the language of social justice, is that, or of international law or humanitarian law, is that it has to be carried out consistently or it's meaningless, right? It is meaningless if it's not carried out consistently. Then you're not concerned about human rights. You're concerned about your rights that are defined by whatever identity, whether it's a border, whether it's a religion, whether it's, a racial identity. Then the justice becomes just for you, and that's not really justice at all.
Right. And this, I just wrote about this, actually. That's why I shared the screen. How certain people are actually claimed into the white identity. For example, the Hadiths, and other people are not. And this is very, how can you say that? This is very selective. It's very subjective, because those who are, I would say, proto-stereotypical are excluded from white, and those who are counter-stereotypical, even though they're part of the same ethnic group, are claimed into whiteness to maintain that kind of dichotomy between who looks according to what we want and who does not look according to what we want, regardless of their culture, regardless of their religion, regardless of their background. And I think that is problematic, because, well, you were talking about here. Let me show you another thing I think that is very interesting for people to see. Let me quickly hide these controls. This video I saw on YouTube yesterday, the top one from Blogging Theology, about I think she's a Harvard professor who studies internalized Islamophobia among Muslim communities in the United States. And she literally talks what we talked about too, that kind of racism and discrimination towards your own group, that shame you feel. For example, seeing other people with Muslim outfit and say that these people make us look bad, and I'm embarrassed for them, and this and that. And what you just said about, like, okay, what comes with identifying with a powerful group is that you also become anti-Black. And I would even go further, like anti-Blackness is really a very central phenomenon in the United States. I get that. But it's pretty much anything non-white, because in Europe, anti-Blackness is not that powerful. In Europe, it's more anti-Middle Easterner, and in particular Turks, Arabs, and Iranians. Like it's in the I would say that they are at the bottom in the social hierarchy. People don't really focus on anti-Blackness. Of course, on the streets and with cops and everything, Black people are always the ones who are the most visible. So the most they have the highest chance in these interactions to be negatively approached. But I would say that this whole binary conception of, okay, if you're white supremacist or you internalize white culture, you're anti-Black. It's pretty much anti anything that's not considered white. You know what I mean? Like it's people who identify as white also start to, even though they may be Arab, and they are anti, they internalize, for example, Islamophobia. They may also stereotype people from India, Black people, you name it. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the insidious thing about the cultures that we are that grew during colonialism, is that there is just one identity that is, how can you say that, free from any systemic kind of racialization, and that's being white. I mean, there's no example in the world, no society where being white makes you systematically, structurally disadvantaged. It doesn't exist. You know what I mean? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, no, I mean that. So I think when I bring up anti-blackness, I think it's important because like I said, there are the idea of being white passing is in and of itself important for the exact reasons you just said, right? Because so I just think it's important to acknowledge that, and maybe it's because I'm using the context of the United States, which is what I'm much more familiar with. I think in Europe, what you've seen in the last, maybe especially last 2 decades or so, given the amount of wars we've seen in the Middle East and the refugee crisis that's been created, that's been mostly a refugee crisis for Europe, much less so for the United States. And so I think it's also that xenophobia and that anti-immigrant attitude that's playing into a particular demonization of people coming from that region, and that tends to be Muslims, Arabs, Iranians, maybe less Turks, but I don't know the numbers, so I don't want to presume either. But a lot of the conflicts have been within countries in the region that have those like backgrounds, and so you have refugees from Afghanistan, refugees from Syria, refugees from Iraq. All of these numbers sort of add up and the thing that's so I think frustrating is the reaction that you get from Europeans, which is like, well, we don't want we need to take care of our own people first. And that's the kind of attitude you hear in the United States too, right? That's what the America first attitude is. But here's the issue. A lot of these people don't want to leave their countries. They're not leaving because they're happy about it. They're leaving because there's push factors. They're being pushed out by war and conflict. And it's not a coincidence that the last 2 decades is the US war on terror. So you also have a situation where we're helping to create refugees, but then getting angry once they're created. And so this is sometimes when people, I mean, look at what's happening right now in Gaza. I mean, what's the plan? I mean, according to Israel itself, the plan is they got to leave. They have to go somewhere else. Where? I mean, in the case of Palestinians, the reason why they're leaving is such a big deal is because historically, when they've left, they have not been allowed to return. And so this is why people say this is ethnic cleansing. You're trying to get rid of an entire ethnic group and take that enclave as another annexation of land for yourselves. So, but what happens but right now they're refugees nonetheless because they can't be in their homes. They've had to leave their homes. I think I saw some statistics, something like 60% of homes in northern Gaza have been destroyed.
Yeah.
60% of homes.
Yeah.
So what happens to these people? They all become refugees.
Yeah.
And so create refugees, and by we, I mean those who are in power, create refugees and then get angry that, well, now we have a refugee crisis. It's like, well, then we should be reassessing the policies that help to create that refugee crisis.
Yeah, but yeah. I would say, as a European, I would say that, to be honest, the refugee crisis is not the issue. The refugee crisis it just legitimizes what was already there. Like, for example, the Turks and
I don't disagree with you, by the way. I should say that. I'm not saying that. My point wasn't to say that there was no racism and then there was a refugee crisis and now people are racist. That's not at all the way that I meant it. I just said that those are factors that help to explain why there's a focus maybe on this particular group.
Yeah, right. So I would say that, when, for example, why is it so much focused on Turks and Arabs? Is that already like in the 60s and the 70s you had the labor immigrants from these parts of the world who became large minority groups within our societies. That's why the Turks are I think still the largest minority group in the Netherlands. I know they are in Germany. And second, probably the Moroccans. Same story in Belgium and many other parts of Europe. So that already grew this severe Orientalism that you would see in our societies. But I would even go even deeper. You probably agree with me, Assal. Is that it's that Islamophobia, Orientalism, that anti-Middle Easterners, so to speak, is just deeply rooted in a European culture. I mean, you can read it already in social or sociological. I've read it in academic work, but you can already see it where in hundreds of years ago, the way they wrote about Muslims and Islam and Arabs and people from the Middle East is very comparable to the things that are still said today. You know what I mean? It's almost an essential aspect of our cultures. You know what I mean? And now with the refugee crisis, because we don't really experience a lot due to these refugees. Really, it's just being made big in the mainstream media. But that is just, I would say, a way to finally vent all these how can you say that, these racist feelings that people have already deeply cultivated inside. You know what I mean?
Well, first of all, it's a refugee crisis because of how many refugees there are. I'm not saying it's a refugee crisis for Europe. It's a
Right.
refugee crisis because we have millions of refugees. And for
Mhm.
those people who have lost their homes, lost everything they have, and had to flee their countries, for them, it is a crisis. And we're talking
Yeah.
about millions of people who have been displaced
Yeah.
in these wars. But in terms of, yeah, I mean, in terms of the history, when you look at, like one of the important historical dates is 1453. We're talking about many centuries ago when I say 1453. But why? Because that's the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, right? And there's this sort of moment in Europe like, wait, the Muslims are coming this far, So there's a very long history that informs, like, that's why when you look at literature from centuries ago, you see exactly the tropes that you're referring to, which still exist to this day. And then, of course, colonialism, right? When you have European incursion into these countries to occupy them, to take their resources, that has a lasting effect. That effect that effect continues to this day. And so, and part of that, when I say something like international law, right? International law was something that really became sort of like serious in the post-World War II era. Even the way those international institutions are utilized is still in the name of empire, right? So we talk about the fact that empire is supposed to be over, right? We're supposed to have sovereignty and self-determination and respect for the borders. And you see that language being utilized when Russia invades Ukraine, but you do not see that same language being utilized when the US invades Iraq, right? That's the problem, is that these institutions are still used very similarly to carry out very similar ideas to what we saw under colonialism. And here's the thing, people think of, I think when you talk to those who haven't studied it, they might think colonialism is this like brute thing that they openly said was brute, right? They didn't. Colonial language was never something that was like, hey, we're the bad guys, we're going to come steal all your stuff. That's never what anybody said. No one speaks that way because it's not like a credible, it sounds ridiculous for me to say it that way, but it's not a credible way of communicating something. So it was, no, we're helping you, right? You're savages, and that's sad that you're savages, and we want you to not be savages. And so under, British tutelage or whatever other European colonial state it was, we're going to teach you how to be civilized. We're going to help you, right? And that kind of language still exists. If you look at the buildup to the war in Iraq in 2003, if you look at the language that someone like George W. Bush was using at the time, he wasn't saying we're going in there because we want to, kill a bunch of Iraqis. That's clearly not the language he's ever going to use. He's saying we're going there to take freedom, these wonderful ideals that we have, right? So those things are deeply, deeply rooted in that colonial history. And it's hard sometimes, I think, for people who are unfamiliar with it to understand why those people who have been colonized understand it a lot more than the colonizer.
Yeah, that point is exactly why it bothers me so much today to find so many people who are uncritical and unquestioning about the dominant narratives, the dominant beliefs, dominant ideology in their country. Because, like you said, if you just throw a dart at a world map and then spin a wheel for like any century, the past, two millennium, and then think in that part of the world at that time, what was the dominant belief? You could pick any example, and today we would look at that dominant belief and say that's absurd. Like, yeah, the French might have said, "Oh yeah, we have this civilizing mission. Our whole enterprise is all for the betterment of humankind." And the British would say the same thing. The Japanese said the same thing. Every single empire has the same lovely rhetoric to try to gussy up their naked power grabs. So we can look back and see all of these examples of the smartest people, the most well-respected people in the society at this time, all believed something that we all recognize today is total bullshit. But you don't then start from the assumption that the dominant beliefs in your country very well might be completely in line with the historical commonplace. But no, people, so many people don't do that. And then on the point of what we were talking about before, the colonial mentality, I was just reading some old papers by Kurt Lewin, and he writes in the 1940 a paper. I don't know if this inaugurated, probably not. This is probably just a psychological look at Jewish self-hatred. I think the article was called "On Jewish Self-Hate," and he's writing about the Jewish population in Europe and the U.S. at a time when anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish prejudice was just completely socially accepted, just out in the open. And he describes the reaction of a lot of Jewish people living in these societies that, it's not like they're thinking consciously in this way, but fundamentally what's happening is there's a recognition that you're going to be hated and discriminated against by a lot of people with power in your society. Therefore, for your self-betterment, you should try to distance yourself away from that group that is so hated. But because we don't think in these kind of logical, rational terms, what ends up happening on a psychological level is forget about the recognition of I'm going to be hated by the dominant group. You end up developing a kind of dislike and hatred for your own group as a means of distinguishing yourself from that group, putting yourself outside of the realm of prejudice and hatred, and trying to assimilate to the dominant group. And so the whole paper is fascinating because it's exactly what, Kareem, you talk about when you talk about colonial mentality. It's just colonial mentality in the particular form it existed in the Jewish diaspora in the 1930s and 1940s. Of course, that has nothing to do with the way that the term self-hating Jew is used now, which basically effectively means a Jewish person whose opinions are to the left of the Likud party. But it's a fascinating paper that I think is exactly the same phenomenon that you guys have been talking about with regard to groups today.
Yeah, what Assal just said about what was it again? What was the last thing that you ended on? I just had something I wanted to link that to internalized racism. What was it again?
Like exceptionalism is the norm. Like every
I remember. So Assal said that the colonial powers, of course, did not go into countries and just say, hey, we're dominant and we're going to oppress you. No, the colonial powers were very good to psychologically colonize as well. And therefore, people believed in their own colonization. They internalized the idea that they were uncivilized and the colonizers were civilized. And you still see that problem today. That has been very, very powerful through education, through religion, to culture, to media, etc., etc. And that brings us, of course, to the discussion that we had before about that internalized racism, internalized Islamophobia, internalized anti-blackness, which is the same mechanism. It's the exact same mechanism as colonial mentality. If you talk about Iranian diaspora who internalized a kind of contempt or sometimes even hatred of people from their own group, or shame, same with Arabs, same with any group. It's just the exceptionally successful way in the past hundreds of years, the way colonialism and colonial cultures have portrayed themselves as better, as superior than other people, and at the same time as such an efficient system of reproducing those hierarchies. If we look at the global media, from CNN to Google to algorithms on Facebook, etc., everything maintains that system of superiority and inferiority. And to escape that is going to be so incredibly difficult. You know what I mean? It's very, very tough.
I mean, you want to talk about internalized racism. When European colonizers were in Africa, in various African countries, some of the products they would sell, right? This is just products, but things like hair straighteners, right? So you wouldn't have natural hair, or skin bleach, bleaching your skin, right? That's the level of racism we're talking about. That's the level of internalized racism we're talking about as well, because you have people who are purchasing these products. And it's not, and that is because you're given this message over and over and over again, repeated, to the point that to the point that you're making, Kareem. It's like, yeah, you have self-hatred that you're completely unconscious of. That's the other part of it. And then you can take that psychology, because I think the psychology behind it is really important. You can take that psychology and apply it in a very different situation, just so people can understand. Just think about women, for instance, and body image issues. How does that happen? How do so many women have, or at least in Western countries, have body image issues? You have things like bulimia and anorexia. Why? Because there is a message that, even if you're not aware of it, is constantly in your face. And even if you're not aware of it, that message is being ingrained in your mind. And so there's things that happen that you don't even realize why, as a woman, you see yourself in a particular way. So this isn't just messaging about race. This is just how messaging works. When you create a norm, when you create the idea that this is good and this is bad, and you say it over and over and over again, that starts to become meaningful to people without them even being aware of it. And it's almost like you have to reprogram your mind to be conscious and aware of what you're seeing. Because you're not. Because unless you're, I'm using I always forget if it's the red pill or the blue pill, but I'm using the matrix as the example, right? But it's that idea that until you can see things a different way, you've just internalized all of this, and you've never really been aware of how much this messaging has gotten through to you over and over again. And that happens within all sorts of different things, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's even how nation states conduct themselves, right? Certain nation states are the good guys, the other nation states are the bad guys. And that's just it. It doesn't matter what their actions are. The actions do not actually matter, because even when they conduct the same actions, they're judged differently. How does that happen?
And this kind of internalization, of course, what I always find so painful to see, really, really painful to see, is that this kind of internalized inferiority almost invites abuse. It almost invites abuse. Let me tell you an example. I live in East Asia. If you travel around Asia, because I've also lived in Malaysia, I've been in many other societies, Taiwan, Japan, Thailand, you name it. If you see what internalized inferiority does, for example, in the sex industry that you would see in Thailand, for example, or dating. Just let's forget about the sex industry. Let's say the dating that you see. It's all these young local people who search for a rich white boyfriend or whatever. And if you are you're sitting in a bar, you're among fellow Westerners, the way that is being spoken about all these girls, or sometimes boys, all these girls or boys or individuals, I should say, that they abuse. Okay, like, oh, they're so easy here. I'm grabbing this one, grabbing that one. People are drunk, they just are open. While at the same time, often you would see that these individuals, the local individuals, really have this kind of hope that they will find that partner. You know what I mean? And I'm like, why is it that that people are often looking for a partner that resembles, I'm not saying they are, but resembles their former abuser? You know what I mean? And that's that power of that internalized inferiority. It invites abuse. Because if you also, there's this very famous sociologist, Jan Breeman, senior sociologist from the Netherlands, who did a lot of sociological research on that kind of colonial racism, what that did to people. But there are also other sociologists who have, for example, shown that you get away with so much abuse when you internalize that inferiority into people. I mean, think about all these Christian missionaries in Africa, all these centuries, and what they did to those kids. Often it was not even that those kids were crying and trying to run away from the abuse. These kids would think like it's almost a privilege that they would be abused by their colonizer. And I'm saying this because it really, I find that one of the worst things, like when you walk around formerly colonized societies, and for example, another example is a former PhD student of mine who told me that when they were young, when they were like 15, 16, they would go to, and that was in Malaysia, they would go to this one girl, her friend would apply for a job in Starbucks because she would know that there are a lot of European men would come there, or expat European men would come there, in the hope that she would get a European man as a boyfriend. Guess what happened to her, during those teenage days? She was used a lot for just sex, and then she was dumped, and used a lot for sex, and she was dumped. And I talked to my PhD student about that, and I said, well, where does that come from? And she said, like, we just didn't realize what was happening. Only when she became older, she realized, like, they were just used and abused in those days. You know what I mean? And I was like, okay, so how come that your friend wanted a European man so badly? And she was like, yeah, you see it on television. You watch Friends and that kind of stuff. You watch all these shows, and you do. And I said, yeah, that's the way you indoctrinate people. Like, you just see that positive portrayal of one group, and you want one, and it invites abuse. You know what I mean? Because these were all old men she would go home with, and yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling on a bit, but I do think you get what I mean.
Yeah, and it is transmitted through TV, movies, popular culture. These are all things that we don't think about in terms of words and in a logical manner. It's about feelings and being drawn to something without really knowing why. It's exactly the same thing that happens in colonial mentality, and that's exactly what Lewin was describing with Jewish self-hate in the 40s. It's not thinking like, I want to be a member of this other group because that would be smart for me, because being a member, being recognized as a member of my group would bring on oppression and prejudice. It's just the feeling of, oh shit, I want to get away from this prejudice. I want to be in the safe zone. And the way that you get that separation from your own group is to feel negatively towards it, and to think like, oh, those people, my own group members, they're terrible. I'm different from them. I'm more like the dominant group. It's the same basic phenomenon in my view.
Well, and oftentimes what's happening with these kinds of divisions amongst people is they're not the ones in power. And then those in power are, well, they benefit from the system as it is, right? That's the entire notion of a status quo. Anybody in power wants to maintain the status quo because that's the condition that put them in a position of power to begin with. So when you're in a position of power, you're usually not like, let's change everything. You're like, let's keep everything exactly how it is, because that's how I ended up here. Even if you're a, quote, revolutionary state like the Islamic Republic, right? That's how you were founded in a revolution, and yet you are now the status quo. And so your entire existence is based on the need to maintain that status quo because you want to maintain your own power. And these types of divisions, we in the study of history or colonial studies and things like that, you always read about divide and conquer, right? You divide people amongst these lines, whether they're, like I said, whether they're borders, whether they're racial, whether they're religious, but you divide people in a way where everybody's at each other's throats based on these identity constructs, and nothing in the actual system changes. And those who are in power enjoy maintaining the status quo, and everyone else is just fighting each other over. I don't think that identity politics aren't important, but I also think sometimes we get lost in them, and that's part of the point. The point is to get lost in these discussions and not really look at, well, what is the real issue, right? Like, what issue are we trying to resolve? What is a problem, and how can we resolve that problem? We don't even get there because we're so busy having these surface conversations that we never get to the deeper part of the conversation. And I think to a certain extent that's by design.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of talk, especially like in Western intelligentsia, about language, but not in the way that we're going to talk about in a second, but more like this focus solely on the power of language and leaving aside regular power, political economic power, military power, which is, for most of the left's history, that's been the main focus, like the most obvious conduits for power to be affected in the world. That's kind of been left aside, and then all of this focus on semiotics and these identity issues, which in and of themselves I think are worth discussing. But the problem, and this is captured in the Chinese term baizuo, the problem is the exclusive focus on objectively less important issues and the total ignoring of much more potent forms of power, political, economic, military power. So yeah,
I think that's sort of like the definition of missing the forest for the trees, right?
Yeah,
like we're
exactly.
we're so stuck talking about only seeing certain parts of this that it's like, okay, let's identify a problem, because there's a lot of them to be identified. Or if when you're talking about conflicts, right? It's like, well, let's identify what the problem is first. And then you can actually try to resolve it. But what you see a lot of times is no one really wants to resolve a problem, and that's why they try not to identify it. And they get angry at the people who try to identify the problem, who actually try to say, well, actually, this is the problem, but you don't want to address that, because what would happen is it would require a fundamental change in a society, and those who are in a position of power do not want to see those things change. They don't want that fundamental change to occur, and so we try to avoid actually just talking about what the problem is.
Yeah, and that's a problem you see in academia, and that's why you have to watch out what you write often, because a lot of reviewers and high ups in academia don't want that status quo to change. These are often very high status white professors who are like, okay, don't go too deep, because that might actually change things. I mean, I've had those experiences myself with reviewing my promotion or reviewing some of my papers, and the kind of reactions that I got from some of the senior professors, which were very, very telling. I wanted to quickly say one more thing, and then we can go to that language issue that you talked about. It's a very important one. About that, you said about Kurt Lewin, who talked about that internalized anti-Semitism or racism among Jewish communities, who then wanted to de-identify with being Jewish, and you have it among Arabs and Iranians and many, many other groups. It reminds me of an example I see here in Asia, and probably people who have been to Asia have seen that, is that you can often immediately see and feel. If you, for example, you see a Filipina lady, and you can immediately feel if she has a Western partner, like, and now I'm also generalizing a bit, but often you can feel that immediately. Suddenly they get this kind of air, like this kind of air, like a bit of an arrogant, almost Western kind of air. And then when you see them communicate with their own fellow Filipinas or Filipinos, you will see that there's this kind of distinction in the way they dress, in the way they talk. Often they speak English, and you see, it's almost like, I saw that a while back in the train, and I was like, almost like, oh, this is such a good example. You almost see it. They talk often almost like a queen who talks to her inferiors. You know what I mean? Like, you had these, you could say almost very typical, I don't want to say stereotypical, but typical local Filipina ladies in the train. And then you had that one lady who I just knew she had a Western boyfriend, because when they got out of the train, I was like, you see, because he was waiting. And she was like very different, and like in her way of speaking to them, almost like, I'm a Westerner and I speak to these locals. It's very difficult to say. It's very difficult to put under words. But if you would sit in the train, you would immediately get what I mean. Like, what that does to people, their sense of self, it changes them. Because I can tell you that lady who suddenly gets that air, she's actually she's actually creating a kind of distance from her own self, like you're losing yourself in a way. I think Edward Said wrote about that, that sense of self that you lose by internalizing the colonizer's way of behaving and seeing your own group and other groups and etc. And that when I saw that, it's so difficult to explain, but people who would be in Asia, I think you, Peter, you would understand what I mean, right?
I think there's also
Yeah.
like an aspect of economic psychology mixed up in that, because if you've been living a precarious life and then all of a sudden you have economic security, that's going to wipe away from your daily cognitive processes all of this thinking, this worrying about, can I afford this? Can I afford that? Do I have enough money to pay the bills and the rent at the end of the month? All of that suddenly disappears. So now your brain has time and space to think about all sorts of things. And yeah, I wouldn't doubt it if most of your friends are still in that precarious situation, your relationship with them changes markedly because now the power distance is just increased.
Yeah, class. Yeah, class.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We
And
have just a little bit more time. Should we delve into the way that the media has been covering the violence in Gaza and how, like, the framing is fundamentally different?
yeah. I wanted to jump to that right now. And I just quite quickly wanted to say about that whole language thing is that we human beings have the tendency to generalize often. And I do it myself too. So when you say, for example, Peter and Assal, many people focus only on the language aspect when it comes to, for example, inequality, but they don't focus on the deeper systemic reasons behind inequality. And then you will see people speaking more and more out about that. But the problem is it shifts then to the other way. So what you then see is that people who still say, but wait a minute, there are also language problems, or there are also identity problems. They will say, oh, that's just identity stuff, FOMO stuff. I don't know what you guys call that in the United States. It's about systemic issues. Stop about those identity issues. So people start to generalize the other way around. You understand what I mean? I've noticed that a lot also here in China.
The way that we say it in the US is Baizor. No, I'm just kidding. I'm trying to push that word into the English language, but with limited success so far.
But do you get what I mean, Assal?
Yeah, and I think that's why earlier I said, I'm like, I don't want to, I think there's a way to have a balance between these, right? Because identity politics are real. Like, that's the other problem. It's like, we can talk about, when you talk about something being a construct, right? Yes, for academic brains, it's like, yes, race is a social construct and gender is a social construct, but the experience of being Black is real. The experience of being, profiled is real. Like, those are real things that actually happen as a consequence of those constructs. And I think that's where you have to have a conversation that balances these two sides out. You can't ignore that those things are meaningful and powerful, but at the same time, you can't only be fixated on that. So to give an example of what I mean, it is clear in every political system that men dominate the political system, right? I think everybody would accept this very basic premise. Even in more gender equal societies, you still see women are half the population, if not slightly more than half the population. They are certainly not half of the population of governments. So they're underrepresented within our institutions of governing. These are just basic facts. So therefore, is it important for women to be represented within government? Yes, of course they should be, because they are half the population. Their interests are not represented within their own governing bodies. In that sense, is it important that you have a woman be president? Yes, because ultimately women should also have an equal access to position that is at the top of the, say, power structure. Is any woman being president the issue? No, because the policies that this woman has are also important. So that's where you have this, where I think the argument sometimes either goes in one direction or the other, where on one side, you have people who completely ignore it. It's like, this isn't about identity politics. Well, no, it's not, but you're also ignoring the fact that women are underrepresented. That's a fact, and we should address that fact. But if I just say, here is a woman, elect her, that's also not enough, right? So there is a balance to be had in the conversation where you're acknowledging the structural deficiencies, right? You're acknowledging the fact that power is not distributed evenly amongst populations that are categorized in these ways. But at the same time, the point of that representation is to represent their interest, not the interest of the already existing dominant status quo.
Yeah.
So that's my best way of sort of trying to distill what the problem is with going in either extreme.
Or to put it in the terms you used before, you can't miss the forest for the trees, but you also can't understand the forest without seeing the trees as well. Like
Exactly.
yeah.
The truth of the matter is, they don't really give a fuck about anybody if you break the shit all the way down to the low fucking dirty ass truth. We say that Black Lives Matter, but truthfully they really never have. No one ever really gave a fuck. Just read your